take that as a yes. So I just uploaded a few files into this conversation. Think of these as in-class handouts. I'd love it if you guys read these between now and next week. They're not mandatory. You're not going to get quizzed on them, anything like that. This is just a very advanced practitioner's take on the organs that we're going to cover today. Heiner Fruehoff is good at what he does. So it's worth reading some of his work on these sorts of subjects. Okay, so I'm getting some questions about whether or not I can send out a PDF of the midterm. I understand that all of you have the ability to take the midterm from the information that I've already given you, and that on a certain level, I've already given you a copy of the midterm. I've been explicitly told that I'm not allowed to give anybody any copies of any of the exams I do ever. So you have the ability to reconstruct most of it if you would like to, but I would rather not actually actively go against what I've been directly asked not to do by my department. Okay, so we're going to be going over, we're going to be talking about these organs, but first we're going to be doing some statements of fact. We're getting into, in some ways, an easier part of the semester, in some ways just a different part of the semester. From here on out, there's going to be very little philosophy. We're going to be much more just in the nitty gritty of how do things work, what's going on with organs and stuff. And to start that off, I want to talk about statements of fact in Chinese medicine. All of this comes from Bob Flaw's book. Bob Flaw's being the not always the best at naming, from his book Statements of Fact in FCM. Might just be Chinese medicine, but got that in the chat. I really recommend this book. I've used the comparison that this is kind of like the these are the things we don't argue about in Chinese. Well, that's not true. These are the things that make up Chinese medicine. These statements are true, period. And I often use the metaphor that these are kind of like the Torah in Chinese medicine, and then a lot of what comes after it is the Talmud. So on the one hand, these are all statements of fact, and we all agree on them. On the other hand, we spend a ton of time arguing about what they actually mean. So the words and the characters don't change, but how we interpret them does. That being said, these are all statements of fact. So these are all things that then become really easy to test you on for boards and comps. There's so much in Chinese medicine that we argue about. This is all stuff where it's like, we all agree on these phrases, and therefore they're easy things to test you on, whether you're a 5-element practitioner or a strict TCM person or a classical Chinese medicine person. These are things we more or less agree on. So yeah, relatively easy to test. And we're starting off with just statements about the ZANG and the Fu. So the ZANG and the Fu, right? The hollow and the solid organ. You guys all know what ZANG and Fu are, right? Good, okay. Just had a moment there. ZANG and Fu are mutually connected. So the yin and the yang organs are mutually connected to each other. The 5 ZANG are seen as one body. So on a certain level, all of the yin organs make up one system. And that's one of the reasons why we spend a lot more time, and you'll notice this throughout your education, we're going to spend a lot more time talking about the lungs and the spleen than we are the large intestine and the stomach. So often the ZANG are seen as primary and are often discussed separately from the Fu. The 5 ZANG are seen as one body. The Fu move qi to the ZANG. The Fu do not produce their own qi, even if they are involved in qi production. So the stomach might have an important role to play in the production of qi by rotting and ripening food. But after that, it moves qi to the spleen. So they move their qi, so the stomach creates qi, moves it to the spleen, and then it's up to the yin organs to redistribute that out to the yang organs. So the Fu often are involved in qi production. they send their product to the ZANG then distribute that throughout the body, often utilizing the food to do so. But this is one of the reasons why, like, the stomach can be producing lots of qi and yet itself not be receiving the resources it needs, because it's not the stomach's job to produce its own resources. That makes sense? Kind of, okay. Why are the 5 ZANG seen as one body? Because they all, so the ZANG and Fu are mutually connected, but at the same time, we can look at the ZANG by themselves as kind of one large organ system or one interconnected system. So in the same way that we might say, like, sure, the endocrine system is connected to the integumentary system, we can also talk about them separately. And so we often talk about the 5 ZANG as being, we often talk about them as more important, but we also often talk about them as more the, what's the right way to say this? The emperor, the Ministry of Health, the prime minister, a lot of the roles that we see as the higher level governing roles within the body are played by the ZANG organs. And then a lot of the lower level, but still very important roles are played by the Fu organs. So in the same way that we might talk about like Congress as one organ, or say national government as one organ, and then we don't really talk about like the waste management systems in the same way, even though they're all part of one giant system, and the waste management system is very important. We don't necessarily talk about them within the same breath, because to a certain degree, all of the Fu get their marching orders from the ZANG. So the ZANG are really more the organizing principle within the body, and then the Fu are the ones who are often enacting those things. That make sense? And we're going to be going through every single one of these organs over this week, next week, and the week after, and maybe the week after that, depending on how this goes. So if that feels a little fuzzy, it will be explained in painful detail. The 5 ZANG and the 6 Fu all receive qi from the stomach. Oftentimes the stomach is seen as the most important organ for maintaining health and life. When we talk about the stomach in 2 weeks, we will go deeply into why that is. But it's important enough that it gets its own statement of fact when we're talking about the entire system. The stomach is where all qi comes from, kind of. The 6 Fu fulfill their purpose when there is free flow. So all of the hollow organs, all the digestive system, as long as there's no stagnation, and as long as there's no serious deficiency, they will do their jobs. So this is something like, we talk about making sure that different organs are talking to each other, that that there's a balance of all the 5 phases to a certain degree. When we're talking about stomach, kind of gallbladder, senjiao, small intestine, large intestine, urinary bladder, as long as everything flows nicely, their job works correctly. This is one of the reasons we care so much about constipation within Chinese medicine. Any sort of blockage within the digestive system disrupts the whole system from our perspective. We want consistent free flow. The 5 ZANG transform humors. I hate that he uses the word humors. The 5 ZANG are going to transform substances within the body. So one of the ideas that we have is if someone has blood deficiency, but they have plenty of qi, we can kind of transform the qi into the blood. And we're mostly talking about the spleen here, which is in charge of transformation. But also all of them.
I have a question.
Sure.
I have a question. If the ZANG is one organ or seen as one body, so, and then you've got like the insulting and controlling cycles. How do you know which, if you're, so it sounds like if you treat one ZANG organ, it's going to have like a domino effect on the others?
Yes.
How do you know which one to treat first? I mean, I guess you treat.
Short answer is FCM4 is going to cover that.
Okay.
So we're kind of setting you up to be able to, there are a lot of things when it comes to treatment that like, all of this is set up. And then you get to FCM4 and they're like, oh, this does this. And you're like, that's why that's like that. Yeah, as you progress through the program, there are more and more of these like, oh, moments. but yes, the short answer is what we start looking at is how do we put a needle in one place and have that ripple out and affect 10 different things? And how do we plan that and structure that? And that's where the real art of Chinese medicine comes in.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep. Slightly longer answer. If you look at an acupuncture point like stomach 36 that has like 10 things it does, that's because of all the ways in which the stomach connects to stuff.
Mm.
Like stomach 36 doesn't do that. Stomach 36 affects the stomach channel and organ to perform these functions because of the stomach's interrelationship with the rest of the system. And the reason, one of the reasons stomach 36 is so powerful is because the 5 ZANG and 6 Fu all receive qi from the stomach.
Mm-hmm.
So if we strengthen the stomach and return qi to the stomach through a He-Si returning point, and we increase the stomach's ability to produce qi, then we also increase its ability to distribute qi to the entire body. That'd be an example.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay.
Yep. So you guys have heard the idea of solid versus hollow organs, right? So the ZANG store and do not drain. They are full. And the 6 Fu drain and do not store. They are empty. So the idea is that we want our ZANG organs to be full. And in theory, they're full of precious substances, which means full of qi, blood, yin, yang fluids. And we want the 6 Fu to be empty. We want them to be hollow. We want them to be a conduit and a passageway. We don't want them to fill up with stuff. So if we have a lot of dampness or phlegm within the intestines, we see that as extra wrong because those places are supposed to be completely empty. 6 Fu drain and do not store. The health of the 5 ZANG and 6 Fu manifest in the eyes. This is a whole branch of Chinese medicine that is worth just passively studying at this point. Just as you see patients, I would say in the clinic, but I guess not so much right now. As you work in the clinic throughout your education, just pay attention to what your patient's eyes look like as you're working with them. We already talked a little bit about Lillian Pearl Bridges and her approach to facial diagnosis. One of the first things to do to get kind of good at that is just to look at people's eyes, look at people's faces while you're working with them. Okay, those are all of our statements of fact about the ZANG and Fu as a whole. So this is our starting point, and now we're going to start going into individual ones. Let me pull up the, maybe I should start with the spleen. Yeah, let's start with the spleen. Thought I had that open. There we go. Okay. So spleen pathology. All right, so when we're talking about the spleen, so now as we go through each of these organs, we're going to go through every organ in the body, and we're going to go through the same format with each one, okay? I meant to make a general slide deck just for this, where it's like, okay, here's what our systems are going to look like, but we'll just go through that quickly. So everyone's going to start off name, then we're going to do statements of fact about each organ. We're going to talk about how they're connected to other organs. We're going to talk about what the general signs and symptoms of problems with that organ look like. We're going to talk about how external pathogenic factors look. We're going to talk about whatever internal ones show up, emotions, for example. We'll talk about diet. We're going to talk about general, like very common patterns related to those, like spleen qi deficiency, how that can turn into a bunch of different things, yang deficiency, damp heat, etc. And we're going to go do this for every single organ in the body. There's only 12, it's not that many. All right, so let's start off here with the spleen. And then this is most of what your final is going to look like, is asking these sorts of questions. Okay, along with some review of the first half of the semester. So let's look at statements of fact for the spleen itself. So the spleen governs transformation and transportation. This is a really important idea. You guys need to know this. Actually, pretty much all the statements of fact are important. The spleen governs transformation and transportation. So anytime transformation or transportation is happening within the body incorrectly, we're going to look at the spleen. If someone starts getting fatty tumors showing up in their body, we're going to look at the spleen. If someone's got accumulation in the feet, accumulation in the head, if someone has something that indicates that things aren't going where they're supposed to go, i.e. not transporting correctly, we're going to look at the spleen. We're probably also going to look at other organs. The spleen doesn't always do the transformation and transportation. It just governs it. So this is like the president of the waste disposal and recycling facility. Like, they're not the one who's actually on the floor doing the work. We're going to look to other organs for that, but they're the ones who are giving out the orders to the rest of the body. They're the organizing principle here. So anytime we have to transform damp, for example, we might look at an acupuncture point like spleen 9, which I'm sure you guys have encountered. Spleen 9, major point for dampness, if what we're looking to do with the dampness is transform the dampness. If we're looking to drain it, we use other points. The spleen controls the ascending of qi. Qi moving upwards is the spleen's job. If anyone here gets a feeling of not quite foggy-headedness, but just empty-headedness after too much studying, like you're around finals time, you've put in way more time studying than you really wanted to, and your head just feels like it's hollow and there's nothing in it and you have no ability to retain information. Excessive studying is similar to excessive rumination. It damages the earth element over time, which means it damages the spleen. As the spleen gets damaged, it gets worse and worse at moving qi up to the head. We use herbal formulas like Buzhong Yiqi and acupuncture points like Du 20 to help raise that qi back upwards. Allison, what's your question regarding transportation?
I think it's just a semantic thing, but
Sure.
in the body as a court, I know the large intestine is transportation. Can you just speak to the difference between the spleen governing transportation?
Sure. The spleen governs it, the large intestine does it. That's the difference. So the large intestine is the actual trucks moving things on the road, and the spleen is dispatch telling the trucks where to go. That make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious about like the mechanism behind it, but I understand if that's too.
So, I mean, we're just going to stay on a metaphorical level at this point. So as we're looking at the person's body, if we see things not moving properly, we have a couple questions to ask. Is this because everyone's asleep at the wheel of the, like, let's say metaphorically, everything moves around the body in trucks and every truck has a driver. Are the trucks not moving because all the drivers are asleep? Are they not moving because when the trucks were supposed to load up, nothing got put in, so the trucks are driving around, but they're empty? Or is it because no one's giving the trucks orders about where to go? And when we're talking about the spleen, we're talking about the organizing principle of transportation within the body. So in theory, the spleen's the part that's supposed to be looking at this and saying like, okay, all this has to go here. Now, the organs that can do this, you go do it. The Sanjiao does a lot of transportation as well. But the Sanjiao doesn't really have, it doesn't have a spirit associated with it. It doesn't have the ability to have intent. A lot of the organs just follow orders.
So when you notice or recognize that a patient is having transportation issues, do you just then ask further questions to differentiate which organ it's like manifesting from, or it's usually the spleen?
You want to get as specific as you can, but not more specific than you need to. So like one of the reasons that large intestine 4 is very popular is because it gets things like, why does large intestine 4 get things moving? It brings qi through being a yuan source point to all of the, it's like giving every truck driver a Red Bull. It's like, all right, we're going to move stuff. Hopefully the organizing principle is correct. And so this movement results in actual change. if the spleen isn't working well, if we don't know where we're taking things, then you move the person's chi, and then 2 days later, they just re-stagnate and nothing ever happened. If their system is working properly, then once you move all that stuff, they have a bowel movement, things get put in the right place, and the change lasts longer. We're speaking at the level of metaphor because that's all we can do right now. But does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Great. Spleen controls the blood. You're just going to have to remember that one for now. We've got a bunch of different organs that do different things with the blood. It's a place that your boards and your comps are going to love to ask questions. Controls the blood, governs the blood, houses the blood, stores the blood. Make sure you know those different words. And we're not going to go too deep into that right now, but we might in another week or two. Controls the muscles and the 4 limbs. The 4 limbs are under the control of the spleen and kind of the stomach. When we say controls the muscles, we're talking about the tone of the muscles, not so much the ability to lift. So when someone's wasting away, when their muscles are wasting, we tend to look more towards the spleen and the stomach than to the liver. Whereas when someone has muscles yet loses a lot of the ability to use them without them appearing to lose their tone, we might look a little bit more at the liver, which is more the contractile force of the muscles. This is also partially just the fact that the movement of chi outwards to the 4 limbs is largely governed by the spleen's transformation function. The spleen opens into the mouth and manifests in the lips. So if people have a lot of mouth and lip related problems, like frequent tongue ulcers, like herpes is not, like oral herpes isn't really a spleen problem, but sudden, consistent, ongoing outbreaks of oral herpes might be a sign that something's going off with the spleen. And the spleen, finally, is the root, oh, not finally, for the first page of statements of fact, is the root of post-heaven chi. So this is really one of these things that gets shared between the spleen and the stomach. Like we mentioned earlier that it used to be just the spleen stomach was kind of one thing since they were in the center. But the root of post-heaven chi just means that this is where your postnatal chi comes from, but really it comes from the spleen and stomach. Spleen controls saliva. If someone has dry mouth, we look at the spleen. If someone produces too much saliva, we look at the spleen. If someone has really sticky saliva, we might start thinking that they have dampness in the spleen. It controls the raising of chi, so simultaneously the spleen is controlling the ascending of chi and the raising of chi. It's the same thing. Don't worry about it. I should delete one of those actually. The spleen houses the E, right? One of the spirits. We're not really going to go too deep into the spirits in this class. It's later. It's affected by pensiveness. So yeah, just for now, I just want you to know where the spirits are. Just don't forget those things. Affected by pensiveness, which I can spell correctly with autocorrect. So the more you think, the more you do mental work, the more you're using the energy of the spleen. The idea here is that digestion of information and digestion of food use the same type of chi within a person's system. This is one of the reasons why there have been lots of historical examples of people who go on fasts when they need to do serious mental work, that there's an association between those two, in part because by not burdening the spleen with food, you can have more energy available for cognitive work, obviously in a short-term period. But this is also the reason why often people's digestion goes off around stressful periods of time that involve a lot of thinking. And one of the reasons why people start getting drawn towards comfort food around midterms, comprehensive exams, serious studying periods, because as you start working more mentally, your spleen begins asking for food which requires less rotting, ripening, and transformation to provide chi to the body, even if that chi is of a lower quality. The spleen loathes dampness and likes dryness. So your stomach is the opposite of this. The stomach likes to have a damp environment. Talk about the stomach in about 2 weeks. The spleen likes to be dry. The spleen doesn't want any sort of moisture. So the spleen is going to tend towards dampness in pathology, and the stomach is usually going to tend towards dryness in pathology. And the last one is that the spleen governs the 4 limbs, which is quite similar to saying that the spleen controls the muscles and the 4 limbs. In addition to controlling the 4 limbs, it also governs the 4 limbs. Kind of a semantic difference there. Jonathan, dry mouth and yin deficiency has to do with the spleen. Not yin deficiency. I mean, yin deficiency could have something to do with the spleen. Production of saliva has to do with the spleen. There are other ways that we could have problems with production of saliva, but it's usually spleen related, yes. It can be somewhat stomach related too. All of these have a touch of stomach to them because these two are the most closely connected of the yin-yang paired organs. Sorry about the kind of potato quality of this image here. But let's look at how some of these organs are connected. So the spleen and kidney have a strong connection between each other. The spleen has connections to other organs as well. So like when we talk about heart, we're going to talk about the connection between the heart and the spleen. So I didn't want to like put every way the spleen is connected now, and then when we're like 5 organs in, there's just no more connections to talk about because we already covered them in the ones that they were connected to. So when we're talking about the spleen being connected to the kidneys, the main way that they're working with each other is that the spleen is providing the postnatal qi that keeps us from having to use the kidney's prenatal qi. At the same time, the kidney is providing that prenatal qi as a spark and as a little bit of fire to keep the spleen going. So if someone's really overworked and really burned out, we might try to pull some energy up from the kidneys to increase their ability to digest food in the short term so that they can produce postnatal qi that can supplement the body. So as we make qi from breathing and from eating, that's what we want to use every day as our main source of fuel. If we don't have that, then we start using our prenatal qi from the kidneys. We want to avoid that as much as possible. At the same time, the prenatal qi is supporting the spleen. You guys with me on that? Okay. So we're going to see a repeat of this slide with each of the organs and looking a little bit different, of course. But I want to give you guys just a little bit of like a general feel for each of these organs and what they look like when they go wrong. This might feel very general, but I don't think we're really going to repeat any of these symptoms with the other organs, and you're going to see this with each of them. It's a big picture of what the organ can look like in general, but yeah, each one's actually fairly unique. So with the spleen, when things go wrong, their general signs and symptoms of spleen problems look like this list. Anything qi deficiency related, we're really talking there about the spleen not doing its job of producing postnatal qi for the system. If the spleen's not producing postnatal qi, we get qi deficiency. Tiredness, common sign of qi deficiency. Weight gain, that's going to be more the qi stagnation and dampness that we tend to see with the spleen. So if the spleen's not properly transforming and transporting food, gu qi, everything in the body, it tends to stack up and we tend to see weight gain, especially abdominal weight gain begin to occur. There are plenty of cases where this weight gain is less from, let's say, an imbalance of calories in versus calories out, and more a problem of the processing of what's brought in. And the overburdening of the spleen is a large aspect of that. Any sort of depressive symptom, we see that related to spleen, that's largely about not raising clear qi up to the person's head or to their heart. So if the spleen isn't properly doing its job of rising clear qi upwards, then we tend to kind of sink down and get depressed, especially when you see patients who report having depression and at the same time have very bad like forward tilting posture. Then we really start looking at the spleen as a cause of this. The spleen also tends to result in a yellowish complexion if it begins to accumulate dampness, especially if it's damp heat. And then any digestive disorder, that one should be pretty straightforward, especially distension. And then any problems with transformation or transportation in general in the whole body. We're going to be looking at the spleen. But we're going to be thinking first, there's probably something spleen related here. In complex cases, this gets a little bit fuzzier, but for a first look at the spleen, this is the set of things I want you guys to be thinking about. And these are the sort of things that might show up on case studies in a final exam. patient shows up with depression, weight gain, and diarrhea and abdominal distension, which organ are you thinking of? That sort of thing. In terms of external pathogenic factors, the spleen's is a kind of an internal organ, but in terms of the internal organs, it's one of the least internal. The lungs and the spleen, the tie-in, are the most external of the internal organs. Both of them have a direct route to the outside, right? And the spleen tends to be attacked by dampness. We see this especially in actual literal damp environments. People who are living in a damp area, people who are living in a house that's moldy or damp. You see a lot of this in the Pacific Northwest. People who end up wearing a lot of wet clothes. This one you see more in tropical regions where people are constantly covered in their own sweat and going in and out of air-conditioned environments. Dampness tends to affect women worse than men. So these particular issues tend to affect the spleen in women more than anything else. That dampness attack can look like abdominal fullness, lack of appetite, nausea, and heaviness. So a lot of times when we're seeing patients who just have mild to moderate ongoing digestive issues, one of the things we might start looking at after we've tried to resolve this within the spleen, talk to the patient about their diet, is what's the environment like that you're in. I have a good friend, this is a concept that used to be well understood, kind of, within Western medicine in general, like Western proto-medicine. I have a friend who got rid of his long-term sinus congestion by moving from Maine to Utah. Like, yeah, he doesn't tolerate damp environments well. I've traveled with him. Anytime we ended up in places where it was really rainy or really humid, his nose clogged up immediately. As soon as we were in places that were more deserty or dry, it wasn't an issue. So you see different sorts of propensities to issues related to the environment here. That should be familiar a little bit, right? In terms of emotions, we're mostly talking about pensiveness for the spleen, right? That fits, that's the emotion related to earth. That's going to stagnate the chi. We've talked about this a little bit here, includes excessive thinking and studying, and that's why the vast majority of you will be spleen deficient by the time you're done with acupuncture school. If you find yourself already getting some of this spleen chi deficiency stuff, if I've been talking about this and you're like, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, you may want to ask your supervisors or clinic instructors or interns about whether or not Guipiwan is right for you. I put it in the chat. It's an herbal formula that tonifies the spleen and nourishes the heart blood, which can be really nice for burnout due to overwork of the mind. Anyone here who came from a background that was very cognitively heavy might want to consider this, especially if you also have problems sleeping. But it doesn't really seem to be stress related. Worry is the other one that really affects the spleen and also affects the lungs, but a bunch with the spleen. And one of the reasons, especially within our culture, that worry tends to really damage the spleen is that we have a culture in which it's been normalized to eat junk food when you're worrying. So the combination of worry about something and then toss a burrito on top of it while you're walking around town worrying is a recipe for chi stagnation within the middle jiao and within the spleen and stomach, which is super common. And one of the reasons why there's a strong recommendation to relax the mind before eating so that you're not taking away the energy of the, like one of the worst things within this paradigm to do for your spleen is attempt to be cramming for an exam while eating food. You're splitting this chi that could go to either digestion or to memorization apart, and you're going to do poorly at both while weakening the spleen. So better to wait until after the exam to eat, or better to eat and then wait for a little while and do the exam. I don't understand how worry would secondarily affect the lungs. Is it because the chi can't move upwards? What do I want to say about that? I think it's mostly about the chi stagnation aspect of this. You see a lot of, like, especially once you get stagnation in the middle, it tends to create stagnation around the lungs as well. Like the lungs are supposed to be doing this rhythmic up and down motion that involves free flow in the middle. And if the middle's really congested due to this sort of worry creating chi stagnation in the area, then the lungs stop moving well and people start breathing. So like you've got 3 sections of your lung that you can breathe with. You can do abdominal breathing, rib breathing, or accessory muscle breathing. So as people start worrying more and more, they tend to start breathing higher and higher into their bodies. So you see people start like for their breath instead of breathing into the belly and into the chest. And as that happens more and more, it becomes a compounding effect where the lungs aren't creating chi very well because they're not breathing well. And if you can reestablish proper breathing, then you're getting better da chi. And the lungs are also the sensitive organ. We'll get to the lungs in a minute, but they tend to be affected by most things. Like all emotions affect the heart. At the same time, kind of everything affects the lungs. We'll get to that a little bit later. This is one of these challenges of talking about the organs. It's like, no matter which one you start with, there are things where it's like, we're gonna have to get to that organ a little bit later. I like starting with the digestive system a little bit, but yeah, there are gonna be some things that we'll talk about when we get to the lungs. So when we're talking about diet, it takes energy to transform and transport food. How much energy depends on what the quality and the constitution of the food is, as well as the person. So really dense, heavy foods and really cold foods take more energy. So having ginger tea in a bowl of rice is going to be almost 0 effort for your spleen and stomach. And having a cold tofu steak, kale salad with tahini sauce is going to be relatively difficult. And depending on the person's diet, we can either get deficiency, stagnation, food stagnation, dampness. We can really get any of the potential internally generated pathogens manifesting in the middle jiao from a person's diet if it's out of balance long enough. And this is one of the reasons why diet becomes really important in talking to people. The spleen and stomach are the root of all of our postnatal chi. If the person's diet isn't supporting the ability to extract chi from food, then they're not going to extract chi from food. Very often people get very nutrient focused. They get very focused on like, this food has all of the vitamins and minerals I need in a very small package. But the focus on the ability of the digestive system to extract that value out of the food becomes lost. So they end up eating food that's very expensive, very dense and very rich, and they get digestive upset and it doesn't make sense to them. And then they tend to make it richer to try to compensate for that. And within Chinese medicine, we're much more concerned about the body's ability to take what we want out of the food than we are about how much is in the food in the first place. We got a few common spleen. Can this relate to herbs that are very tonifying? 100%, 100%, 200%, absolutely. Over tonifying and creating stagnation is one of the major errors of students in their first 2 years, and sometimes longer. Let's go over some common spleen patterns here, and we'll try to breeze through this fairly quickly. Are you talking about like protein powder supplements? Could be, or just a green smoothie with 7. Juicing is an easy example of this. Someone who's like, oh, I had 7 beets for breakfast in the form of juice. One of the rules of thumb of juicing is never consume more in juice form than you could eat raw by itself. Like if you can't eat 4 apples for breakfast, you probably shouldn't drink 4 apples worth of juice. Especially if you're then going to put protein powder on top of that and then toss in some nut butter and then a bunch of ice cubes. Okay, so some common spleen patterns. We're going to kind of breeze through these a little bit because you're going to go over these in later classes. I just want to start introducing you to what some of these look like. We've gone over what the general spleen pathology looks like, and I just want to break it into a couple different categories. Thank you, Lindsay. So spleen qi deficiency, we're not really going to see much of the dampness here. There's a little bit of it, but mostly this just looks like spleen. This just looks like the person doesn't have qi. So their appetite's decreased because your appetite is telling you how that you're not that you're, when we say, is someone hungry, what we're asking is their body ready to receive food and process it? So when we see poor appetite, despite them potentially, like, so we see someone who is qi deficient, who in theory should be eating more food, yet they don't have an appetite. That's a sign for us that their body's saying, yes, while we understand that we need more food, we can't take it in right now. So stop putting it in. So poor appetite is often a sign of spleen qi deficiency. This is one of the reasons why stomach 36 is often used to build up someone's appetite. You go hard on stomach 36 for someone who's not hungry, and often a couple hours later, they're like, I'm really hungry. Great, that's what we wanted. We wanted your body to give you the signal that it's ready to receive food. Abdominal distension after eating is the same idea. The food comes in, the qi attempts to work that food. The food is too dense for the amount of qi the person has, and so the qi stagnates, the food stagnates, and they get bloating and distension. Tiredness is just a lack of qi. It's doubly true for spleen qi deficiency because that tiredness is also going to come with a lack of qi being raised upwards. So it's not just low energy, which you would see with any qi deficiency, it's low energy with a little bit of a sinking downwards. That's the same thing here with the laziness and lassitude, like desire for napping is often spleen related. Desire to lie down. These are just steps. Tiredness is one level. It's worse if you also just feel lazy and like you don't want to do anything, and it's a sign of even greater spleen qi deficiency if you just don't want to stand up. Edwin, I thought stomach 36 was more energy when you don't have any. It can be. It's bringing qi back into the stomach organ because Hosi points return qi to the organ, right? So it's bringing qi back to the organ to increase the function of the stomach, to increase the ability to rot and ripen food, which then increases your ability to extract things from it. We'll talk about stomach 36 a bit when we get to the stomach in a couple of weeks. Paleness is the same idea. As you get the spleen qi deficiency, the person just has that look of like, spleen qi deficiency is where you kind of start going like, are you feeling okay? This person just looks like all the time, that like tone and brightness to the skin isn't there. And again, when I say pale, if we're talking about people with different phenotypic expressions, different levels of melanin in their skin, it's not necessarily whiter or drier, it's just less vibrancy within their skin and within their general appearance. You can see that it looks like they didn't sleep enough the night before. Not necessarily bags under the eyes, but maybe, but we're just kind of like, sort of appearance. Weakness of the limbs, because the spleen governs the limbs. Loose stools, in part because the spleen has to lift things up, and partly because the food might not be completely digested. And weight gain, and that's just the long-term version of this, as the dampness accumulates. Spleen qi deficiency can lead to a bunch of different conditions here. Don't worry too much about what these conditions are. I just have this slide here to show a little example of how something as simple as a lack of an appetite in Chinese medicine due to spleen qi deficiency. When a patient comes in, they're like, I don't really have a good appetite. We see that as stage one of something that 7 stages later could result in them having blood in their stools, for example. Don't worry about these specifics. You'll get to this in other classes. Weight gain can be related to dampness, yes. If you guys, I'd prefer if you guys message the group publicly so I can answer you audibly as opposed to messaging me privately. If it's private, message me privately, but if it's something that you want to share, if you just don't want me to call out your name, that's okay, but I like people to be able to see the questions. So yeah, weight gain can be related to dampness. Sometimes draining a lot of dampness out of someone who is overweight is enough to begin, or strengthening their spleen and stomach is enough to begin a process where their weight just starts disappearing. So we talked about like yin, blood, qi, and yang are all on a spectrum here. yang to yin, with blood being a more yin substance and qi being a more yang substance. So we've already talked about qi deficiency. Yang deficiency is just qi deficiency with more. And in this case, the more is mostly about coldness. And if we went from tired to lazy to wanting to lie down, the next level is wanting to curl up in a ball. So it's not just lying down, but wanting to lie down and actually protect the person's middle, kind of hold their spleen and stomach in. And this coldness. And edema can start to show up here. This edema is the transportation process breaking down further. So these fluids that are supposed to be circulating around the body accumulate. This is doubly true if they are accumulating at the bottom of the body, like in the ankles, because the spleen is supposed to be raising things upwards. We got a couple different qualities that go along with the dampness. I'm just going to kind of skim over these here because I think this is important, but you're going to go over this again later. I just want you to be able to read this here, which is why it's in the slides. So you get this heaviness that's part of the dampness. The poor appetite's still there, in this case, because there's a substance that really needs to be transformed that's already occupying the space. If we clear out the cold and the dampness, the appetite will come back. Damp heat in the stomach is very similar. You get this thirst without a desire to drink, which is an interesting symptom. So the heat is in there. It's cooking off some of the fluids, so the person doesn't have a lot of healthy fluids within their digestive system. And the dampness is there, but as we mentioned a couple weeks ago, these pathological substances like dampness don't perform physiological functions like moistening an area or being proper fluids for an area. So the person will be thirsty because they need more fluids, but they don't want to drink water because the area is already occupied by this dampness. So if they do try to drink, it just becomes more of a burden upon the spleen. So they get thirsty, but they don't have a desire to drink. Now, that might sound like a silly symptom. I think of this clinically as patients who say, I know I should drink water, I just don't. I just can't bring myself to do it. Sounds to me like you're describing thirst without a desire to drink a lot of the time.
What do you do for that?
Depends on the patient, but very often we just start treating them for dampness and they just get thirstier and thirstier as we clear up the blockage.
Mm-hmm.
And keep telling them to drink water.
I have a question, Peter.
Sure.
About that. If someone comes into you with that very thing and they're like, I know I should drink water, but I just can't do it and I'm not thirsty, and then they force themselves to do it, can that help clear some of the dampness or no?
Sometimes what I usually prefer they do, often when someone says, I know I should drink water, but I just don't, what I have them do, is I have them get a big mason jar, a liter-sized mason jar, and I have them get a tea that's going to be appropriate for whatever their condition is. Something weak, so not really at the level of like aggressive herbal medicine, not anything that's going to taste bad. Like, oh, you've got damp cold accumulated in your middle, then like a ginger tea with, again, my cha would be really useful for helping to drain that out of there. Not strong, not some oversteeped thing, just really gentle. And usually if you're imparting an energetic and temperature quality that helps to balance out what their experience is, it tastes better and feels better as they drink it. That make sense? Yeah, so that's usually my approach, is find a way. So like during the summer when everyone's really hot, something as simple as tossing a few chunks of watermelon or cucumber or mint into someone's water, all of a sudden they're drinking a lot more water. Like people are sweating and they're like, yeah, but I feel all congested and gross inside because it's like humid and hot and I'm sweaty and I know I'm dehydrated, but I don't want to drink any water. Like, well, as soon as it's mint and cucumber water, everyone's like, ooh, a treat. And the same thing happens in the winter. You just turn it into like even the yogi tea sort of a thing. It's kind of a chai spice blend in the winter, and all of a sudden be like, oh, this is nice. Like, yeah, it's nice because I guess it feels kind of fancy, but also it's nice because it's actually giving you the energetic qualities that you need to make this digestible. Okay. Sung, so if it is no thirst, why can't it be dry? What is the difference? If the person's dry, they tend to be very thirsty and drink a lot of water. That doesn't mean that that's going to be absorbed correctly. So sometimes you see people, for example, with a lot of internal dryness who drink tons of water, but still have clear urine, but stay dry. Like the water just passes right through them. That becomes a different problem. But usually dry people with a lot of internal dryness tend to have thirst and a desire to drink, but that may not actually get them to generate fluids. Water in a glass and fluids inside your body are somewhat different. It has to go through a transformation process to become fluids, which is one of the reasons that it takes work. One of the things I want to point out here with the damp heat is that the damp heat is where we get a lot of stinkiness showing up. So as people start to, I'll get to that in just a sec, Danielle. So with damp cold, you tend to see a lot more like edema and stagnation and laziness and heaviness and lack of desire to put anything into their system. And with damp heat, you still have all this fullness, but you tend to have desire to bring things in, like desire to eat food, desire to drink fluids, but you tend not to actually want to do it, or you feel sick afterwards. So this is the like, I feel full and distended, and yet I'm buying a burrito anyways. And I'm not quite sure why. And then it also tends to come with a lot of gas, burping, flatulence, and a lot of bad smells that accompany that. And you go a little further, then you also have nausea and vomiting. I've had a couple cases of patients who have come in. This was working in Cyprus a few years ago. I had a couple of patients who came in with like, I kind of have this eating disorder where like I eat too much food and then I get really nauseous and sometimes I throw up. And they're thinking that it's they've been told it's some version of bulimia nervosa. And so you just have an accumulation of damp heat, and as we clear it out, then this just takes care of itself. There's also conditions where it is bulimia nervosa, but sometimes it's just that there's something off in their system that we can just correct. Would dryness
I have a question. Sorry.
Yeah, let me answer Danielle's one second.
Okay.
So would dryness also be related to lung deficiency? It absolutely can be. So in this case, I suppose we're talking more about, yeah, you can definitely have lung dryness. Lung dryness is very common. I get a minor case of it after 3 hours of talking. It's normal. Lungs get dry all the time. Yeah. In fact, metal and dryness go together. So that's the place we see dryness the most. Lungs, stomach, large intestine. Okay, what was the question from the class?
So you were saying for like damp, cold, they're heavy, they don't want to move, they don't really want to eat. And for the damp heat, it's kind of the opposite. They do want to eat a lot, but that they also are having like gas and flatulence and things like that. So
Yeah.
Would that mean that damp, cold doesn't necessarily have those digestive aspects to it? Or
Damp cold tends not to be stinky. It tends just to be more backed up and congested. And damp heat, the heat makes people want to be bringing more things in. The heat keeps stuff moving a little bit, but it's often moving in a way where nothing's really getting processed. The dampness is still there.
okay,
The
so
damp cold tends to just be heavy, stagnant, nothing.
but they would
there.
still have like gas and loose stools and all that, or not?
Very
necessarily?
possibly, but it's unlikely to smell bad.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, we have 2 more slides here. You guys can just take a look at these a little bit. This is the formula I mentioned Gui Pi Tong for earlier, spleen qi heart blood combination. And one of the most common things, you'll hear about this all the time in the clinic, is wood overacting on earth or the liver overacting on spleen, which is where you get all these signs of spleen qi stagnation, plus sometimes a little bit of spleen qi deficiency, and a bunch of times of signs of liver qi stagnation. So you get the tiredness and the abdominal distension, but it's also painful. You get the reduced appetite, but you also feel full from the stagnation, and you're pissed off at everybody all the time. Yeah. Okay, that's about it for the spleen here. I'm happy to, you're all on break for 10 minutes. but I'll also answer questions and hang out during the break. And then when we come back, we're gonna do lung and we'll be done for today. So I'll see you all at 3:22, and I'll be here for 10 minutes and answer questions. Yeah. So sunme with rumination lend itself to a particular temperature, damp heat or damp cold. Depends on the person's constitution and what sort of foods they're eating. So if someone is a raw vegan and ruminates a lot, they're probably gonna end up damp cold. If they're a hot wings-atarian and a whiskey-atarian, they're probably gonna end up with damp heat.
Peter, I have a question.
Yeah.
So for spleen chi deficiency, is it does it have that? Wait, does like damp heat invading the spleen also feel like you don't want to eat, loss of appetite, or just thirst? No, without drink.
Semantic issue, first off. The damp heat doesn't invade the spleen, because invade means it's coming in from somewhere else. So it's usually that it's been internally generated. So we just have damp heat in the spleen. Nancy, no. I'll go over that in just a second. What you usually have is, once you have damp heat in the spleen, then you usually don't have spleen chi deficiency with this, not really. This is usually just an excess pattern. So this is a pattern, for example, where usually you're not using stomach 36, or if you are, that's like the one point that's a tonic point, and the rest of them are all trying to drain and get this out of there. So this is more like large intestine. Often we're doing more intestinal stuff just to try to move this down and out of the person more than anything else.
And one more thing. So for cold, damp in the spleen, does the patient feel cold?
Often if you do, so I do abdominal palpation as part of my practice. I rub people's bellies while I'm doing my intake with them very frequently. Often people with damp cold or yang deficiency, their abdomen is literally cold to the touch.
Okay.
But
So
they often don't feel particularly cold. They may or may not, but usually you can feel the coldness. That's doubly true if they also have a little bit of edema, like if their circulation's not great. But often what you have is this balancing act between, like, on the one hand, because their circulation isn't good, they should be cold. But at the same time, they're often bloated, larger than normal, have put on a little bit of weight, and all of this combination almost works as an insulator. So it's like their circulation's not good and they should be cold, but they're also kind of wearing a little bit of a fat suit at the same time, which keeps them warmer. So then as you touch them, you feel the cold, but it kind of balances out for them.
So does that mean that spleen chi deficiency is also a little bit in cold damp since the weight gain?
Can be. It's more that the cold and the damp together are both yin type pathogens.
Yeah.
And so even if the person's spleen chi is fairly healthy, these are both burdening the chi and the yang pretty heavily. So the longer someone has cold and dampness inside their system, the more likely it is that they will also have yang deficiency, because it's constantly being affected. In the same way that as if people have heat in their system for a really long time, it tends to create yin deficiency because it's burning off the yin. But the yang is constantly working to try to get rid of the dampness and the cold. And eventually, if it doesn't succeed, it's going to lose and it's going to start getting weaker.
So
that makes sense?
Yes, it makes sense. But like, you know, how is like I guess this scientifically, like, you know, how people poor appetite so they don't eat. So it's just like a little weird that I see them weight gaining.
Actually, but let me stop you right there. Poor appetite usually has nothing to do with whether or not people are eating.
Okay.
So what I'm saying by poor appetite is, this is something we'll talk about this a little bit when we get to the stomach. But when we say appetite in Chinese medicine, we mean like sensation of hunger in the middle jiao. A lot of people are like, oh, I know I need to eat because I'm getting tired, or I know I need to eat because I'm getting angry, or I know I need to eat because it's 1 p.m. and that's when I eat, but my body doesn't want to eat. I'm not actually getting signs that there's a request for food. I've just correlated other things with a desire for food. A lot of people don't experience actual hunger in here, that like
Even though they're
churning.
actually hunger.
Yes.
So they
So
just don't feel it.
they don't have it because that system's already overburdened.
So do they eat?
And then they tend to eat anyways, yeah.
They can
So
still eat.
I've had lots of conversations with patients who have extra weight, who want to lose weight, who have a lot of dampness accumulated. And I say, like, do you experience hunger? It takes us 5 or 10 minutes before they understand that I'm talking about a sensation in the abdomen that they may not have had for 10 years.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, so when we're talking about poor appetite, I mean, there are plenty of people who eat because it's a habit, or they eat for comfort, or they eat because they want to feel that fullness, or they get anxious if they don't eat, but none of those are hunger.
Okay.
From the Chinese medicine perspective. When we say appetite and hunger, what we mean is a healthy spleen and stomach with enough fire, good fire, not pathological fire, to request more food. And when we get to the stomach, we're going to talk a lot about this, because this is coming more from the stomach. Like I said, these two are intimately connected. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
That makes sense?
Yes.
Sure.
Thank you.
I heard that grains were good for spleen qi deficiency. Have you heard that, and do you know why?
Yeah. So we like grains in Chinese medicine. We don't like grains constantly at large volumes. So along with a lot of the Chinese dietary advice at first seems a little bit counterintuitive. Like, we really like white rice. We kind of like it more than brown rice most of the time. And people hear that and they go, wait, but white rice is just simple carbohydrates and that's all it does. And why do we want a lot of just simple, easy to digest carbohydrates? Well, we want relatively small amounts of white rice compared to, say, your local Chinese takeout restaurant. And the main function of the white rice is to supplement the spleen and stomach qi to aid in the digestion of other foods that come with it. So when you construct a meal within Chinese medicine, all the different aspects of the meal work together. So let's say someone's blood deficient, but also spleen qi deficient. If we want to build up their blood, we might say, like, you need to eat steak. But when they eat steak, they can't digest it. So we're going to add in other foods to make it so that they can digest the steak.
Oh, okay.
A really easy example of this is sushi, where the wasabi and the ginger are both there to balance out the temperature and the density of the fish. That's their function. So you eat those things with it, and then it's not cold, and then it's not heavy, and you can digest the sushi.
Okay. Yeah, because I can't eat straight unless I have it with rice. So I guess maybe it's the similar concept.
Yeah, that's the sort of idea.
Okay.
I've got like an hour-long talk on the energetics of wheat. The main problem that we see from I don't have anything special to say about gluten. I just don't care that much about that perspective because that's not what I do. But when we talk about wheat's a fairly strong tonic, and it's the grain associated with the wood element. And so it's great for growth, but it's not great for maintenance. And rice is associated with the earth element. Rice strengthens the earth. We don't necessarily, on a cultural level, need a lot more independence and growth. So you choose different grains based on the needs of a person. Like, for example, it's like I'm trying to clean my body out a little bit right now. Oatmeal is really good for that. That's the grain associated with metal. So that helps to pull things out of you as it goes through you.
So is it better to eat the grain that maybe your personality type? Maybe more?
Or just whatever it is you're trying to do at that stage of your life. I mean, like, you could talk about it constitutionally, sure. You can also talk about it as like, okay, I'm about to embark on a really stressful period of my life, so I want to make sure that my earth stays healthy, so I'm going to be focusing on rice. And then after that, after I've maybe accumulated some stuff that I want to clear out, I've got a little bit more of a peaceful period, I'm going to start doing some meditation, and I'm going to switch over to oats to kind of clear things out. And, after that, I'm a little bit deficient, so we're going to have more rye in the diet to build up the kidneys. But because the rye is heavier and harder to digest, I'm going to make sure that when I'm eating that, like maybe I'm sprouting that rye, or I'm combining it with ginger or some other, or toasting the rye berries before I work with them so that they're easier to digest.
Mhm.
It's that sort of thinking.
Right.
But nutrition's a whole class or year.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are different ways of thinking about it, but that's the way I found to be most useful.
Thanks.
Nancy, you asked the formula GUAP1, so that's GUAP1 is for spleen Qi with heart blood deficiency. And if we're talking about Xiao San, let me try that right. Yeah. There's another one. There's another Xiao San spelled differently that's very different. Is for liver overacting on spleen. I recommend against prescribing herbs for yourself before you've taken any classes in herbology, and talk to your person, etc. Like Xiao San has an herb in it called Chaihu pluriradix that you guys probably learned about in Intro to Herbology, and it's a great herb, but excessive long-term use of it damages the yin. So you want to be careful about how that's getting used. A lot of people just use Xiao San forever, and that's not really a good answer. That's not really what it's made for. It's made for short to medium-term use while you get rid of the reason why you need it in the first place. But it is great for short to medium-term use. Also very good for often one of the presentations of premenstrual syndrome is liver overacting on spleen. As the stagnation occurs, as women get ready to menstruate, sometimes that creates a situation in which the liver will overact on spleen, and Xiao San can be very helpful if irritability and bloating are two of the main symptoms that women experience.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Shoot.
Is Xiaoyashan also used for like menopause?
No. Shouldn't be. Really shouldn't be. I mean, like if you were creating there's the Kampo Japanese style, we're about to get right back to class here. There's the Japanese Kampo style of herbal compounding in which you can use entire herbal formulas as if they were single herbs. So like you might take 5 different herbal formulas and combine them together in different ratios. And you might put a little bit of Xiao San into a formula for someone who's going through menopause. Or you might take some of the ideas from Xiao San and put them into a menopausal formula. But you don't use Chai Hu generally without a good reason for women who are going through menopause because of the damage to the yin. You usually use an herb like Xiangfu instead, or even Chuanqiang, or Dangui, something that has more of a tonic aspect and not just a moving aspect. You usually use like Zhibai Dihuangwan, which I just put in the chat, is a common herbal formula for women going through menopause with a lot of hot flashes. Wildly different formula from Xiao San. I'm also teaching Herbs 1 next semester. So if you guys want to talk herbs more, sign up for my class. Okay, let's quit out of this spleen pathology and let's open up lung. Is this working for you guys? This format of going through each organ, is this interesting? Cool. Just it's kind of awkward to teach this stuff online because it's very hard for me to see all of you and see my notes at the same time. Like I'm used to teaching in a classroom where like I can pace around the room and I can notice if people are like swearing at me under their breath. So if you're finding any of this difficult, please shoot me an email, let me know, talk to me. It's an odd format. Again, even with the Zhibai Dihuang one, like make sure you talk to someone before prescribing it because there are plenty of times you wouldn't want to use that, even in that situation. Okay. We got everybody back here. How are we looking? Yeah, that's looking pretty good. Okay. Close enough. So let's start going into the lungs here. So we're going to do the same thing, statements of fact. So the lung governs qi and respiration. It shouldn't really be a surprise that the lungs are in charge of respiration, but they're also governing the qi of the whole body. If qi is doing something that we don't like, so when we're saying that the spleen governs transformation and transportation, we said, like, oh, well, you know, if we see transportation going wrong, we might ask, is it the truck driver or is it the dispatch that's telling the truck drivers what to do? If we see things going wrong with qi in the body, period, we have to ask the question of at what level is this problem occurring? And often there's some lung involvement that we work with. This is one of the reasons why lung 7 is such a commonly used point. Using the function of the lung guo, we can unblock stagnant qi. If we combine that with large intestine 4, which happens all the time, then we're unblocking some of that stagnant qi within the body, and we're moving qi out, and we're moving qi at the same time, and we're doing it as a source-luo pair. So that combo right there, all of that together incorporates 2 aspects of the metal, and metal is what we use for cutting things out of the body. So on like 5 different levels, lung 7 Li4 is a useful way of getting stagnant qi to become unstagnant. That doesn't mean you use it every time that's what's going on, but it's one of the reasons why it's a popular combo. One of the reasons. The lungs also control channels and blood vessels. Blood vessels are an extraordinary organ within Chinese medicine. And that's about the entirety that you're going to hear about them for your entire education. But there are some good books that talk about this sort of thing if you're interested in some light summer reading. And if I ever turn the book back into the school, where did I put this? There's a request a little while ago, I think from Kyria, who I'm not sure if she's here today, for more books by female authors. Elizabeth Rashad.
I'm here.
Hi, Kyria. Claude Lair helps translate, but this is mostly Elizabeth Rashad de Valet. She wrote this book, The Extraordinary Foo. She's written a bunch of books. They're not beginner books. It's like a year from now, maybe start looking at them. But she's got a whole section in here, excuse me, on the vessels. So like, I don't know, 20 pages just talking about the classical texts and what they say about the vessels and why they're an extraordinary organ. And we're not going to talk about it any further right now. But just letting you know, when we say control channels and blood vessels, that's not a superficial statement. We're also not going to go much deeper, but just know there's further to go there. Controls the diffusing and descending of qi and blood. So if the spleen is in charge of raising things up, right? The spleen's in charge of ascending. The lungs are in charge of descending. The stomach is a little bit too. That's the name of the book, Nancy. And the author is Elizabeth Rashad de la Valle. Mark Kubel will be happy to talk to you at length about this. He's set up talks that she's done in the US. He's a big fan. And she's great. Heavy French accent, but great. She's French. Controls diffusing and descending of qi and blood. So if you have a patient that comes in with facial swelling, one of the first organs we're going to think about is, why did the lungs allow this to happen in the first place? Because the lungs were supposed to bring this downwards and they failed. So what happened? The lungs also regulate all physiological activities. That's a massive statement. And when we say that the lungs are the prime minister of the body, this is part of what we're talking about. It's that they're the kind of one of the places where like the buck stops here for things going wrong. And it's one of the reasons why we use lung points pretty frequently. So when it comes to physiological activities, the lungs are supposed to be governing that. I think of this a lot in terms of the rhythmicity of the breath of the lungs, helping to move everything through the body. Like The lungs are by far the most active organ in the body in this sort of a way. This is also, the lungs have a relationship of like this bringing in and letting go, and bringing in and letting go. There's almost a Taoist spiritual aspect to simply the motion of the lungs. It's like you bring in and you let go. There's discussion in some Taoist texts of like bringing in life and letting go of life on every single breath. Yeah, so physiological activities, lungs regulate them. They regulate the water passages. So anytime we have fluid related problems in the body, we look at the lungs. So like the liver is in charge of free flow of qi. So if we have a bunch of, and the spleen is heavily involved in edema. So, okay, our patient has edema showing up in their legs. Is it because the spleen's not rising? Is it because the liver is stagnant and not allowing for free flow of qi? Or is it because the lungs are failing to regulate the water passages? These are all options that we might want to look at for that. Also controls the skin and the soli. So we know that the outside of the body is, the skin is related to the lungs. And the soli, that layer in between the skin and the muscle, like when you do like a Tui Na rolling the pearl technique, where you pinch the skin and roll it around, that layer that it's rolling through, that's the soli, kind of the layer that the connective tissues separate. And this is also a statement about metal, right? Metal's about boundaries. So at the end of the day, the serious boundary between us and the outs and what isn't us, the place where like the line is clearly drawn, is our skin, and that's also the lung. Which like on a Western physiology level is kind of interesting because the outer layers of our skin are completely dead. It's like the outer layers of us that we think about as us are to a certain degree not really us at the same time, right? Like if we look at like this 5 different layers of skin, the last 2, they're just sitting there and slowly flaking off. So the actual border is a little bit fuzzier, but yeah, lungs are that sharp demarcation. The lungs manifest in the body hair. I mentioned this a little bit earlier in the semester, mentioning it again now. So kidneys, head hair, lungs, body hair. Lungs open to the nose. So sinus issues, we're looking at the lungs. Dry nose, runny nose, mucus-filled nose, lack of smell. All of these things are things that we're looking at the lungs for. And of course, controls nasal mucus, right? That fits. Houses the Po, the ethereal soul, corporeal soul. Houses the Po, corporeal soul, got that backwards. Damaged by worry, grief, and sadness. And the last one here is the lungs are the delicate organs. This is mentioned a number of times in some of the classical texts, that the lungs are delicate. And part of the idea here is that the lungs, being metal, their job is to get things out, to cut things away. Metal doesn't regenerate well. So as damage is done to the lungs are poor at repair. And they're not only easily damaged, but once they're damaged, it's hard to recover from that damage relative to other organs, with the liver being the one that recovers the best because it's wood. Like wood, you cut down half the tree goes back, no problem. Which I don't think that they were doing, like, I don't think they were cutting out people's livers back in ancient China, but it's interesting to note that the liver is the organ that, like, you can cut 2/3 of it out of most people and it will actually grow back. Kind of cool. I'm not going to attribute that totally to chance, but interesting. So let's look at the connection between the lungs and the spleen. So again, like, we're going to see the spleen show up in a whole bunch of these different organ connection things, but I didn't want to put all of them just in the spleen slide. So the lungs and the spleen are connected because the spleen makes the qi and the lungs govern the qi. The spleen ascends, the lungs descend. The spleen sends the qi to the lungs to produce zong qi, right? The gathering qi in the chest. And when you have pathology, when the spleen produces dampness, one of the ways that we get dampness out of the body is through the lungs. So if you get a lot of, we try not to like actively encourage this when treating, But this is one of the reasons why, like, oh, if you have a lot of mucus, you don't want to drink a lot of milk because milk produces more phlegm. Like, that's a culturally received concept. And in Chinese medicine, what we say is when you have a lot of dampness already, you don't want to bring more. When you have dampness in the lungs, you don't want to bring dampness into the spleen because the spleen will put it in the lungs as a way of getting it out of the body. So sometimes you'll see patients come in and you go, this patient has dampness in the lungs because they're coughing up a lot of phlegm. But the reason they have the dampness in the lungs might be because of their spleen and because of their diet. And so as we attempt to, every week we're like clearing phlegm out of the lungs and like, oh yeah, after I left, I coughed up a bunch of phlegm and you were right, like spitting it out helped. I didn't have phlegm. And then it started coming back a few days later. And the real problem is that they eat ice cream for every meal. This is also one of the reasons why culturally there's a lot of spitting in Chinese culture. The theoretical idea for this is that if you get phlegm in your lungs and you cough it up and you swallow it, you're just repeating a cycle where it just ends up back in the lungs. So I often encourage patients who have a lot of phlegm, just carry a handkerchief with you and just spit out that phlegm, and this will stop in a couple of weeks, as opposed to swallowing it back in and putting that burden back on the spleen. Jonathan, so we've gone over the idea of governing a few times here. We talked about it back with the spleen. And the idea of governing is that, so I assume we're talking about like governing the chi. So the lungs are going to be the ones who are kind of giving the orders at the level of a governor for what the chi is supposed to do. And then it's getting enacted by different systems within the body, mostly fu organs. So the lungs are telling the chi what to do, but then that happens through other systems. The lungs, being the prime minister, are kind of at the peak of the hierarchy of ordering things around. The heart, as the emperor, kind of doesn't do a lot. We're going to talk about that next week. It kind of does everything, kind of doesn't do anything. Day-to-day functioning of the body, day-to-day maintenance of the body, lungs are the ones who are giving most of the orders. They're the prime minister.
Can you give like just an example of like how it gives like a command to different organ to do something? You know, yeah.
So it regulates all physiological activities in the body. It controls the diffusing and descending of qi and blood. It does these things by governing qi.
Oh.
So it tells the qi what to do, but qi doesn't do anything on its own. So it's going to say like, okay, we need more, like there's an imbalance between the upper, middle, and lower jiao. And we're going to regulate that imbalance through the san jiao, but it's the lung qi that's making sure the san jiao does that. So we might want to descend qi through the san jiao from the upper jiao to the lower jiao. We might use a point on the san jiao channel, but we're going to be more likely to use points on the lung channel to make that happen, because we want to give the order to the san jiao to make that happen.
Okay, got it.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Sure. Good. These are not easy concepts, like govern versus control versus regulate. It's like not super helpful, but this is the language we have. And make sure you know the pedantic differences between them, because you're going to get tested on them again and again. So let's look at some general lung pathology here. I think we can maybe get through the lung today. Let's see. So qi deficiency, just like the spleen, qi deficiency might tell us to look at the lungs, because the lungs are integral in the creation of qi. Spleen's kind of more important, but they're both very important. Pallor, so this is more of the paleness that you get here. So this is less just the looking drained and tired, and this is more like almost like you saw something scary, sort of blood leached out of the skin coloration. Changes in the size of the chest. So anyone with like kind of a sunken chest, like that, like reverse spoon sort of a chest, we're looking at lung problems. People with long-term sadness, lingering sadness. Like I had a patient a number of years back whose chief complaint was grief because she'd lost her dogs. She had 2 dogs that she loved, and they'd passed away. And she was just racked by sadness about this. This was, I think I was still an intern for this. This was a long time ago. And being a relative newbie, I didn't ask great questions the first time. In second or third treatment, I asked her, like, I'm like, something's off about this. What's going on? When did you lose your dog? She's 12 years ago. Now, I totally understand grieving the loss of an animal that you love. 12 years of grieving a dog is what we would call inappropriate sadness. So it switched from moving on from the dog to figuring out what was wrong with her lungs that she couldn't let go of them. Skin problems, anything skin related, we look at the lungs, period. Now, just like the spleen can put phlegm into the lungs and dampness into the lungs, other organs can cause problems with the lungs that manifest in the skin, right? The root might be deeper than the lungs, but if there's a problem on the skin, we're going to look at the lungs first. We just might look at other things second and third. Give me just 1 second, Jasmine. Let me wrap up these last couple things, and then I'll take that question. Allergies are largely lung related, but I'd go further and say allergies are metal related. Because one of the major functions of metal is saying what is me and what isn't me. Like, let's draw this boundary and figure out what's what here. And allergies are often when you're confusing one thing for another, when you're taking something that isn't dangerous and treating it as it is, when you're treating something that could be useful to the system and going, no, that's bad. That there's something off with the metal there. We're not always great at getting rid of allergies. It's not something I've ever really tried to do that much. That's not my specialty. But there are some people within Chinese medicine who work with the lungs and the small intestine actually to do this. Phlegm, any sort of mucus coming up, we're looking at the lungs. And people who get sick all the time, because one of the things that the lungs are governing is wei qi, right? So they're governing qi, and they're governing the skin and the so li. So from a couple different levels, they're really in charge of the wei qi of the body. So people who get sick frequently, we're looking at the lungs. All right, let's take some questions. So, okay. That's a lot of questions. Jasmine, go ahead.
I forgot my question now. What were you talking about when I said that? I'm sorry.
Allergies, maybe? I'm not sure.
Oh, the skin. You were saying how all skin issues, well, most skin issues relate back to the lung. But I've also heard that, like, say, blood stasis can cause, like, acne in the chin area. So how would you differentiate when something is really lung or something is blood stasis or some kind of stagnation in another organ that's manifesting?
Right. So if there are general skin conditions, we're always looking at the lung. So if someone has like dry skin or oily skin, we're always looking at the lung. If someone has problems, for example, on a dermatome or along the line of a channel, we might be looking at a channel pathology. In the case of acne on the chin, we're usually looking at the Chong meridian, the extraordinary meridian, the Chong. But at the same time, the fact that it's manifesting on the skin means there's some degree of lung involvement here. These problems might just be passing through the lung and the skin on their way out of the body, but you generally want to, they can manifest other ways too. It's like, so a person's getting, damp heat is getting expressed on the skin. Why is it on the skin, and why isn't it getting expressed through the urine or through defecation or getting coughed out of the body or coming out through mucus in the eyes? The fact that it's coming out through the skin tells us the lung is somehow involved. It might be involved this much, but it's still involved. So it might not even be a place that we're treating very much as we're resolving the problem, but we have to look at how it's playing a role. And your questions are getting that question's a little more complicated than what we're doing at this level of analysis, because that involves multi-stage diagnosis. But yeah, so it can be more complicated, but we think about the lungs first, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're the most important thing.
When you say involvement, is there a way you could clarify that a little more, or is that ahead of us?
Involved is kind of the right word here. So if there's a problem with the skin, then there's a problem with the lungs because of the connection between the lungs and the skin. At the same time, that doesn't mean that that's the main problem. In the same way that, like, within our world, it's like if there's, you know, if there's a line of 50 people outside of Trader Joe's because there's a pandemic, we know there's a problem with the Trader Joe's, but that might not be the real problem that's going on. Like, there's an issue there in that exact spot, but maybe there's a broader issue that we need to take into consideration. So when we have a problem with the skin, we know the lung is involved, but that doesn't mean that that's where the problem is. We just know that somehow the lung is connected to this story. That's it. And that's about as far as we can go with that for now. And you'll have plenty of classes to ask these questions in the near future. Okay, Christy, what is it when someone can't let go of sadness for so many years? How do you treat? Like 5 classes from now, you're going to get into that. That's way outside the scope of this. It can be a number of different things, but there are mechanisms through which sadness is supposed to propagate and process through the body, just like food is supposed to process and propagate through the body. If something goes wrong in that process, people can get stuck in a certain time period of the processing of that emotion. And we have acupuncture points and theoretical frameworks to help them move to the next stage. At a very superficial level, I would look at some of the upper kidney points, names like Spirit Graveyard, that can help people move from one place to the next, or some of the last liver points like liver 14, chapter gate, about going to a new phase, passing through a gate from one period to another. Both of those are points that are useful. Both of those are points that are useful for moving forward. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. So one of the people here had a comment about a friend who has a concave chest, and there's a lot of tragedy in their life. And yes, especially like if a parent is having a really severe event that then is unprocessed, we're more likely to see this manifest in the children in a way that seems to just be like, oh, you're born with it. And it's like, well, this may have gotten into the jing of the parent and passed onwards to the next generation and then manifest physically in the next generation, and they have to clear that up. But don't worry too much about that. What about if someone has trouble letting go to the past? I think I just covered that with some of those points. So me, what's your question?
So when you mentioned allergies and how they're metal related and, you know, distinguishing what is me versus what isn't me, like, can autoimmune disorders be addressed through needling lung or address, you know,
Yeah.
herbs for lungs?
Yes. So we're going to be using things for metal, and we also work with the small intestine because one of the small intestine's functions is separating the clear from the turbid, being able to tell what you want to keep and what you want to get rid of. The lungs are largely about, so if we're talking more autoimmune, that's more metal related. And if we're talking things like leaky gut, which can lead to these other things, then we're talking more small intestine.
And then one more follow-up question. So if chi is emotion, if a person has difficult time drawing boundaries in their life, is this, like, I'm assuming this is being manifested in things like autoimmune disorders as well, like where you don't know what's appropriate and what's not?
Yes. The virtue of the metal and of the lungs is propriety, correctness. For people who have trouble doing what is correct within their life, we usually work with metal, which is a concept that people don't like to talk about, but you know, it ruins people's lives. So yeah, we work with metal a lot. Metal gets a bad rap. It gets a bad rap because we have a cultural problem with metal. That's about as much as I'm going to say about that. The US has a cultural problem with metal, at least for the past 50 years. So people are like, oh, metal people are jerks. Metal people are difficult. Well, if we're looking at this holistically, like, it's kind of a problem that we're thinking that way, isn't it? Like, aren't they supposed to be an integral part of the whole? If we're thinking that they're jerks, like maybe that's actually a reflection about a larger societal issue. We could probably use more healthy metal in general. Okay. So moving on to some more lung pathology. So we just went through this set right here, general lung signs and symptoms. But let's talk a little bit about external pathogenic factors. So lungs get invaded very easily when it comes to EPFs affecting the body. They like damaging the lungs, and this is one of the reasons why the lungs are delicate. I mean, there's a little chicken and egg thing here. It's like, well, do the lungs get damaged by external pathogenic factors because they're delicate, or are they delicate because they get damaged by external pathogenic factors? I don't really care, but the reality is that things from the outside world affect metal and the lungs a lot because it's our boundaries. It's the most exterior, interior aspect of the body. Spleen is the second most exterior, interior part of the body, which is really saying that tai yin is the most exterior part of the interior part of the body, which is why it's the first of the 6 stages when you enter the interior. There's a lot of the use of words interior and exterior there, but don't worry too much. So it's delicate, and when I say exterior here, I mean exterior part of the interior. Frequent external pathogenic factors are a sign of pathology and usually a sign of lung pathology because the lungs are the main organ involved in defending against it. Now that might be because the spleen isn't generating chi, but you know, that's like saying our army keeps getting defeated, and the problem might be that we're not funding our army enough. But at the end of the day, it's still a problem with the army, right? So just metaphorically, it's like, okay, this is our physical border guard protecting against these exterior invasions coming in. Maybe the problem is that we don't have enough resources at our border. At the same time, maybe the problem is that it's still a problem with the border. Let's not relate any of that to contemporary politics, please. Okay. Dryness. The lungs need fluid to function. Dryness is the pathogen most associated with metal. If you guys remember back in week 1, and I assume in studying for your midterm, we've got that fluid production and circulation diagram. And excessively dry conditions or pathology in fluid circulations can result in lung dryness. We see dryness affect the lungs more than any other place. People have dry skin all the time. It can often be easy to miss dry skin because a lot of people moisturize and so you don't see it, but in theory, we shouldn't have to do that much. Dry cough, dry throat, dry skin, and one of the consequences of dryness is that we see things become fragile as that yin substance is soaked out of it. It's almost like things become brittle. So if we see signs of even emotional brittleness, like easily triggered into sadness from very small stimuli, along with dryness, we might be thinking, oh, this is that the lungs have become brittle. And the lungs also have the ability to become damp, though this usually comes from the spleen and is usually due to diet. We mentioned this earlier. Instead of sending this good chi up to the lungs, it's used as a route to remove phlegm and dampness from the body. This is why we want to spit out the phlegm and not swallow it. This can also just be being in the human environments, which we also mentioned when we were talking about spleen. And sometimes what happens here is we get this like damp and dry combo going on as the dampness begins to obstruct the water pathways. Like the lungs do a lot of stuff with like descending fluids, for example. But if we get an invasion that hits the lungs and hits the upper gel, we might end up with like dampness and fluid accumulation above and dryness below, or vice versa. Because the lungs are so involved with circulation in general, these pathogens can kind of nest together a little bit here. Don't worry too much about the specifics of that, but we can get some interesting combos. The difference between dampness and phlegm when we're talking about the lungs is usually dampness comes up pretty easily, and phlegm is usually very sticky and dense. So dampness is more like, and it's up, and phlegm is often more of like, sounds a little more hairball-like. Long-term sadness can become a positive feedback loop. So person becomes sad, that sadness dissolves some of the lung chi and makes the lung weaker. Because the lung is weaker, it can't process the sadness stays, continues to dissolve the lung qi, and the person gets weaker and weaker, and the sadness sits and roots down and kind of defeats the person from the inside out. This is generally when we tonify the person and build them up. One of the places we sometimes see this is in postpartum depression, when people go through the birthing process, but get to the point where they're going into labor and they're already very deficient, and they come out of it extremely deficient. And any sadness that's lingering in here now, you don't have the ability to move it out, and it sits and it just eats away at the little bit of chi that's left. If you or anyone in your life is pregnant or looking to become pregnant, building up their chi and blood is one of the best things you can do for them. We are amazing at both preventing and treating postpartum depression. Really, it's not hard at all. And it's a lot better than being put on major mood altering drugs in the first year of being a new parent. Worry knots the chi. That's the other thing that tends to affect the lungs. So sadness tends to create lung chi deficiency. Worry tends to create lung chi stagnation. You see this a lot in people who, when they get confronted with difficult or worrisome situations or stressful situations, which cause them to become worried, they start coughing. You see this in congenitally weak-lunged children, where when they're confronted with stress, they get asthma attacks. This can come from the liver stagnating. It can also come from worry knotting the chi in the lungs. And you tend to see a lot of really shallow breathing with this, that, sort of panicky breathing as the chi knots and stagnates.
Is that also with dry mouth too, Peter? People get nervous and they kind of get dry mouth, and you can hear that their mouth is drying out, and would that be a lung reaction?
I don't know.
Maybe that's more heart. I don't know.
People get nervous and their mouth dries out. I think that's more fear causing the chi to descend. So we're going to talk about this with kidneys, which is not going to happen this week. But we talk about the spleen being in charge of ascending chi in the body. But underneath all the organs, the prenatal kidney chi is sitting there. So if the kidneys become heavily affected, all the other organs get affected. And so when someone becomes really fearful, that can shut down. Fear doesn't really affect the spleen, but it affects the bedrock on which the spleen is built, which is the kidneys. So if a person becomes really fearful, often that everything seeps out of the head, can't think clearly, vision can get a little blurry. People can pass out from fear for the same reason. People urinate from fear, especially children, and the mouth can go dry. Yeah, that's more of a kidney thing. How is lung metal related to earth element? Worry. Well, every emotion affects a bunch of different things. It's just they tend to affect some things more than others. So when you become fearful, it affects the kidneys, but it also affects everything a little bit. And the lungs get affected by a lot of stuff. And when we're talking about worry affecting the lungs, worry isn't always going to affect the lungs. When I worry, I get it in my stomach. My lungs, despite the fact that I used to be a smoker when I was younger, my lungs are pretty strong and healthy, thankfully. But for me, I mostly get worry as a twisting sensation in my abdomen. Some people, worry goes straight to their lungs because that's almost their personal point of vulnerability for that emotion. If someone's very lung chi deficient, very lung yin deficient maybe, but has a healthy spleen and stomach due to, let's say, years of sadness or abuse of the lungs through substances or skin damage, lots of different things, then the worry that should be affecting the spleen might take the path of least resistance and affect a weak area. That answer your question, son?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. In terms of habits, the lungs are pretty heavily affected by improper exercise. So the lungs being in charge of all this movement in the body are also aided by engaging in movement. So for those of us who are spending like 20 hours a week on Zoom calls, it's not great for our lungs, which means it's not great for the regulation of all of our system. It's just like excessively sedentary lifestyle. You wouldn't think it would necessarily damage the lungs, but the lungs, ribs, and diaphragm need this movement because the lungs being metal, tend towards becoming excessively inflexible. So we need to keep them moving. We want the metal to function a little bit like wood, and we want the wood to function a little bit like metal for them to be helpful. The metal on its own doesn't want to move and can become brittle. The wood on its own wants to grow and shift and move everywhere. And we want to actually kind of make it a little bit more solid and structured. So movement's important for the lungs, or else you get chi stagnation. And smoking is a direct invasion into the lungs of dryness and heat. It can also be an invasion of toxicity, and this damages fluids and causes stagnation, and the heat dries everything out and deranges it a little bit. Why do people smoke? Outside of, like, forget all the stuff about what tobacco does within a Western sense. We're just going to spend a second on this, and I'm not going to take a lot of questions on it because we're not talking about addictive substances. Excessive exercise has to do with the heart. We'll talk about that next week. When you smoke within Chinese medicine, the lungs do a lot of emotional processing, and smoking shuts that down. Your ability to feel all of those emotions and to work through them, you're able to barrel through, like, let's say you've got a lot of sadness. If you don't want to feel that sadness, smoking cigarettes can stop that from happening. If you've got a lot of trauma, smoking cigarettes can stop you from really having to deal with some of that to a degree and make you relatively able in the short term to function despite that being there. Long term, it's a train wreck, but short term, it actually provides benefit on an emotional level, fake benefit to a lot of people. I'm just talking about cigarettes. Well, I'm really talking about any inhaled particulate substance that damages the lungs. And then the different substances have different secondary and tertiary effects. So like marijuana has a different set of effects. Cigarettes tend to put more heat and dryness in the lungs, and marijuana, for example, tends to put more dampness and heat into the lungs. It tends to be less drying. Marijuana has plenty of negative side effects for people's lungs in some conditions. It's just different. Okay. There's a great section in Lonnie Jarrett's book. I think it's in the Clinical Handbook of Chinese Medicine. I'm typing it in the chat. Where he goes over, I don't completely agree with everything he has to say here, but it's a very interesting take that's worth spending some time on. He talks about drugs for each element and how they all promise you something and give it to you in the short term and then take it away in the long term. That, like, for example, marijuana promises creativity and promises to turn you into an interesting person in the short term. And then in the long term tends to sap away the yang aspect of the wood and make people relatively less of that. There are, of course, exceptions. He talks about alcohol as well. I'm gonna cut off the rest of the conversation about addictive substances here and mind-altering substances, but that's a great set of things to read. He talks about what sex does in an addictive perspective, cocaine as a metal ingredient, hallucinogens as a fire thing, ecstasy. It's in there. It's very interesting. But it's a set of things that's it's useful to understand how those things may be working from an energetic perspective outside of just a chemical perspective. Okay, some basic lung patterns. How are we doing on time? We are running out of it. Okay. I'd like you guys to get to know these. I mean, so I don't really care to spend that much time on the patterns for each of these organs. I want you to read these and review them a little bit, but you're gonna learn these in detail in other semesters, along with the pulse and the tongue and more information about them. I just want this to be like I want you to see these once before you start getting into them in deeper levels in other classes, and understand that I may be quizzing you on them at some point, but the quizzes are not going to be tricky. I'm going to give you like all of the symptoms and ask you which one it is. Lung qi deficiency. Shortness of breath is a big one here. Weak voice is a big symptom of lung qi deficiency. As soon as you have a patient that you have to lean in to hear, they have lung qi deficiency, something to tonify. Spontaneous sweating is often a lung qi deficiency issue. That's the borders not being secure, the sweat just leaks out of the person. So this level of spontaneous sweating is like, I'm sitting here, I'm chatting with you, and for no reason that I can discern, I start sweating. I don't feel hot, I'm not breathing hard, nothing really happens, just start sweating. And the aversion to cold is also this weakness on the exterior. It's that when you find yourself in a cold area, the cold is able to penetrate easily. If you build up the lung qi, then you can enter colder and colder areas, and you can feel it getting colder, but it doesn't bother you. So when we say aversion to cold, what we mean is being bothered by the cold. Lung yin deficiency. So again, like qi deficiency is on the yang side of things, so we don't really have lung blood. That's not a thing we talk about. So, but we do talk about lung yin. So here we're going to see signs of dryness from a lack of the nourishment from the yin. Again, a weak voice, but it's more like weak and hoarse. So this is the person who sounds like they've got like, they're trying to speak through wood in their mouth. Kind of sounds like a long-term smoker, but less of like a barking aspect that you might hear with a long-term smoker, and more of this like straining to get the voice out. You see this a lot with older people. Fits. You tend to get lung deficiency of one type or another as you get old. Dry mouth and throat, thin chest. You see this sometimes as people age, how their body changes tells you a lot about what's been going on with their system. Sometimes people get old and they get shorter in general, but they just get bigger. Some people get bigger in the abdomen, but their chest almost falls inwards. Sometimes their posture really falls apart in some areas and not others, and ways in which their body changes as they age tells you what organs have been dysfunctional throughout their life and gives you a roadmap to getting them out of that. If you can catch the first stages of that when they're 30, you might be able to stop it from happening when they're 60 with almost no intervention. So this is one of those, like, the more you, if you're sailing a ship from Japan to the west coast of the US, a 2-degree difference is the difference between Seattle and LA. If you're already 90% of the way there, you got to turn that ship dramatically to change where you're going. So if we can catch these things early, you start to notice the person who's like 30 and they've already started doing this in their chest, folding inwards. If you can get that to open back up then and help them to fix that problem then when they're 60, they're not going to look like a hunchback. Right? Marge and her sisters for that voice. Yep, that's pretty much right. So we do want to contrast lung yin deficiency with lung dryness, where it's just dry, 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 and hoarse. The thirst shows up here with lung dryness, whereas when we're talking yin deficiency, we expect to see actual changes to the physical form, and we expect to see problems showing up at night. With dryness, we don't get these. That's just with the yin deficiency. But the dry cough, the hoarse voice, dry mouth and throat, those are the same in both. So if the question is, patient has these things, but there's no changes in their physical form and there's no problem showing up at night, then it's just dryness. But if it's all of these things plus night sweats, then there's a yin deficiency component, right? It might be talking about a future exam question here. We're gonna have to stop in just a second. I want you guys to read through the rest of these. Wind, water, there are a couple things to point out here. So wind, water invasion into the lungs, you get facial swelling. Attack from the outside, obstructs the area, the lung can't descend, facial swelling. You get a decrease in urination because all the fluids are trapped up here and the lungs actually have to descend fluids downward to aid in urination. So the urine levels are decreased. This is also one of the reasons. Did you guys learn Ma Huang in Intro to Herbs? Yeah, okay. So if you remember, Ma Huang, one of its functions is promoting urination. That's because it's descending the qi. The reason it promotes urination is because it goes to the lung and the urinary bladder and moves qi downwards with its bitter aspect while moving it outwards with its acrid aspect. So when we see that it's promoting urination, we could just say, oh, it's a diuretic. But that's not what we care about. What we care about is, why is it having a diuretic function? It's having a diuretic function because it descends G downwards, which is also why we can use Malwong for facial swelling, because it descends downwards and helps get fluids out. Danielle, give me just 1 second and I will answer that. We're talking about lung heat. We get some interesting symptoms like flaring of the nostrils. Like if you think of like an angry bull that's getting ready to charge and it's like sort of thing going on, you'll see patients that come in and on the inhale, like they're constantly breathing a little bit hard, and you actually see the nostrils moving as they're doing so. This is usually a sign that there's heat in the lungs. And when these sorts of people cough, it's usually like mid sentence coughing that interrupts other things, because the heat speeds things up and deranges them a little bit. So the cough is often unpredictable and comes out of nowhere. And often these people are constantly trying to catch their breath. Like they're just sitting there and they're talking to you, but they're still like almost breathing in weirdly while they're talking, because the heat is making it so that it's almost like they're exercising at all times. So you see those sorts of presentations, you start thinking there's probably some heat going on in the lungs. Or me at like hour 8 of lecturing. Once we start talking damp phlegm, we start getting all of the signs we were talking about dampness, specifically in the phlegm. So this distension, this fullness. Yeah. So look over the rest of these. We will talk about them next week. Come in with questions. If you look over these and you go, wait, why does wind heat have sweating as a function? I want you to try to think it through. I want you to come in with a hypothesis. This might be a nice way to start next week with a couple of questions from here. Just have people answer or put it in the chat. I'm trying to give you guys logical reasons why these things happen. Like a lot of times when this information is taught, it's like, just memorize this. But I want you to be able to think through, like, wait, why with heat in the lungs would you think that the person might have rashes? It's like, well, lung to skin, easy. SOB stands for shortness of breath, not son of a bitch. So when it comes to sweating, why would heat in the lungs, especially wind heat that's come in from the exterior, cause people to sweat? We talked about it with G deficiency, but it might be a different function here with some similarities. So I'm going to officially stop the class here, but hang out for questions. So if anyone needs to go, thank you, and I'll see you next week. And otherwise, I'll hang out for the next 10 minutes and take care of any questions anyone has. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Peter.
So you're very welcome. So Danielle, would lung yin deficiency also affect the yin organs? Is that what you were saying? So let's go back to lung yin deficiency. Well, yeah, once you get lung yin deficiency, like one of the things that happens here is because of all of these other, all the symptoms that start showing up, the yin deficient, anytime you have a pathogen somewhere, it tends to spread. So if you have lung heat, you tend to start getting heat in the heart or heat in the large intestine. Like these pathogens like to bleed outwards. And once you have yin deficiency, things like the night sweating, you're just losing more yin every time that happens. So the lung yin deficiency can kind of move around a little bit in a certain way. I wouldn't necessarily say that the lung yin deficiency is strongly affecting the yin of the other organs, but it certainly has an impact.
Thank you.
Yep. Sorry, 1 second. Someone's trying to call me, and that's not going to happen right now. SIB stands for shortness of breath. To the person asking me if I'm teaching Foundations 3 next trimester, I would love to. Email the head of the department, ask him to have me teach classes, and I get more classes. That's how it works. I have no idea how you teach Foundations 3 online. So, because it's about looking at tongues and it's about taking pulses. It's like it's a tactile class. So I don't know how that works. Yep, just keep bugging them. That's all. Like I don't have another mechanism to recommend for this. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Nicole. I'm looking forward to teaching Herbs 1. I love herbs. They're fun. And I mean, like as far as I'm concerned, if you're rote memorizing without an understanding of the functional reasons why these things are occurring, it's, unless you have the sort of brain that just works like an encyclopedia, the information just slowly falls away. So my goal in teaching this class and in teaching Herbs 1 is that, I mean, it's not going to be perfect, but ideally by the end of it, you should be able to reverse engineer most of the information. So like, for instance, if I do a good enough job and if you guys study hard enough, I should be able to say, what does lung yin deficiency look like? And you should be able to go, well, let me think this through, as opposed to recalling the information, and basically take a ton of educated guesses as to what it probably looks like. And then you should mostly be right. And I like, and you can do the same thing with herbs 90% of the time. And the more that can happen, as far as I'm concerned, the more you're an actual Chinese medical doctor and the less you're a Chinese medical technician. Like the difference between a good law school and a bad law school is a bad law school teaches you how to exercise the law, how to do law, and a good law school makes you a lawyer. Teaches you to think like a lawyer, turns you into a lawyer. Difference between a good cooking school and a bad cooking school is that a bad cooking school teaches you how to make recipes, and a good cooking school teaches you how to be a chef, how to derive recipes from nothing. And I'm trying to the best of my ability to do that here with these classes. I'm not perfect at it. And part of the reason I'm teaching is to get better at doing that too. Okay, couple more questions here. So, pumped about Herbs 1, great. Including the possibility of teaching FCM 4. Hey, just keep asking. I'm open to stuff. I would much prefer to teach a new class every semester than reteach the same ones. Like I'm probably only going to teach FCM 2 for a handful more semesters before it's become rote enough for me that it's no longer that it's hard to bring the chi to it, that there's less life to it. Why is it wind water and not wind damp? Yeah, so Carly, when we say wind water here, wind water, what we really, I'm gonna have to guess, because my understanding of this is that a wind water invasion is a wind invasion which disrupts the flow of water, of fluids within the body. So wind dampness, you'd expect to see a bunch of dampness in the lungs. But with this wind water invasion, the person's not coughing up phlegm. They're not coughing up anything really. They might cough a little bit, but it's not, there's nothing stuck in the lungs. What we've really done is obstructed the fluid processes within the body. And so this swelling is almost, it could almost be like wind invasion causing edema. Might be almost a better way to say this. Causing weird edema, causing this facial edema. I've seen this like, I think twice clinically now. And like with acupuncture, you can almost watch their face start to shrink back down. It's really cool. Yeah. So that's how I understand it.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Is there a progression for lung, i.e. Qi deficiency, dryness, yin deficiency, heat? Oh, 100%. There's a branching tree of like 500 things that also interact with all the other organs. We're giving you like the level 1 and a preview of some of the ways it links to other things. But one of the things that makes Chinese medicine diagnosing a little bit of an art is that the differential diagnoses expand dramatically and quickly if you're trying to look into someone's past. So it takes a while to get good at it. It takes a lot of patience to get good at it. But once you start to get a little bit better at it, you can see patients, and as they're talking, you hear like, okay, mid-20s, you just told me a story that tells me that your earth got severely damaged and then there was some sadness that hurt your lungs. So I've got this chunk sitting here in your 20s. And then you mentioned this thing like, when I was a kid, I was really driven and okay, so there's a wood aspect when you were a child, and that's going to somehow feed into here, and I don't know how yet. And this comes over here, and oh, you started smoking after this thing happened in your early 30s. And you start connecting all of these pieces, and you see this almost narrative through the person's life that's really individual to them, but follows a fairly simple set of potential rules. And then when they get to whatever the current manifestation of the problem is, and they're like, and I'm here for insomnia. It's like, okay, so now you've got insomnia. You've got insomnia because you have blood deficiency, but you got to blood deficiency because you decided to go vegan, and you decided to go vegan because you had an idea about being pure and being correct. So that's a metal related issue. You developed a metal related issue because you were a smoker for a while, and this was like a rebound. So you smoked for a little bit, and then you went, no, I need to be clean and pure, and you went overboard to the other side. But you started smoking in the first place because of this sadness that was there before it. So you get this long chain of things that all connect together. And if you can reflect that back to the patient, like not telling them like, oh, here's who you are, let me tell you about your life story, but instead being able to empathize with the life experience that got them to where they are, and maybe empathize with the reasons they made decisions that they now feel shame or regret for, it can kind of unlock aspects of this chain. And then you put the needles in, and then they're able to release and let go of a lot of that stuff. And you put the needles in a way that reinforces that. So when we're talking about progression of these sorts of disorders, it's like, yeah, the person gets lung heat, well, the lung's going to dry stuff out. So over time, you'd expect the lung heat to cause lung dryness as well. So maybe they start off with like this breathlessness, and then it turns into breathlessness with like a little bit of dry cough. And because they have the breathlessness and the dry cough, but it's also like kind of hot in there, and it starts to accumulate, and it's like, oh, this is just heartburn. So I'm taking a lot of antacids, and then that's starting to affect my stomach. It's kind of damaging my stomach young. So now I'm not producing as much postnatal chi, and then that's going to cause more lung chi deficiency. And then that gets worse. And now I'm not sleeping well because I'm also sweating at night, and I'm coughing at night because of the dryness, and that not sleeping well messes. So yeah, there's a lot of ways that these things interconnect. And that might sound like a ton of work to figure all that out, but it just happens as you treat patients. It just happens as you get experience, if you have a foundation that allows you to begin to think that way. That make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. It might sound really complicated, but totally doable. It's just a question of learning some of the tools and then treating 10,000 patients.
But I guess it's a different progression for each person depending on their experiences.
Well, like the diet's going to change their progression. Their behavior is going to change their progression. Like two identical twins with identical diets, and one of them works, 12 hours a day in an air-conditioned building, and the other one works 14 hours a day outside in the heat. We're going to expect to see different things arise. So all of these lifestyle factors, we expect to see them impact people differently. Two different people with the same job and the same diet with different constitutions, we're going to expect to see different progressions. And it's one of the nice things about Chinese medicine. We really see everyone as an individual. But that's because we have a tool set that allows us to. Like the philosophical understanding of how things work allows us to see a person and go, not like, oh, I see lung qi deficiency. It's like, oh, I see how the heat has impacted this, but then the sadness did this thing, and then that's what happened with the lungs. That makes sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Sure. There's a message here about, yeah, so in theory, the online classes are going to include people from other campuses. So yeah, it could be interesting to have people from other schools. I really like teaching the first year, where I don't think it makes that much of a difference because everyone's kind of in the beginning. What I'm really excited to teach once, the schools are up and running again are things like needle tech classes. Like, I think that's an area that would be a lot of fun. Yeah. How do I feel about teaching herbs online? I feel fine about it. I really miss having a whiteboard. But yeah, I'm fine with teaching herbs online. I think it's one of the easier ones to teach online because it's very theory heavy. I'd like for everyone to be able to taste some herbs and sample them and that sort of a thing, but not that big of a deal. I don't know how FCM3 gets taught online, and I don't know how practical classes get taught online, but herbs can be done online. Okay, any other questions? Have I answered everything? Have I missed anything? Is it also a PowerPoint format for herbs 1? It's a reader. I'm going to give everyone a reader, and then we're just going to have Bensky open, and that's it. And the reader is basically just copying out of Bensky. There's enough in Bensky, and you're only going to be tested, if you take herbs 1 with me, you're only tested on what's in Bensky. That's it. And we're cutting 95% of that out. It's a very clear set of things that you're being tested on. And that's it. And I'm giving you everything you're tested on to the best of my ability, along with an image of the herbs in color in a PDF and a bunch of blank space where you're going to take tons of notes that you're not going to be tested on, but that make a difference later on, because frankly, just Bensky's enough to be tested on. That's the current format. I might futz with it a little bit. I tend to. Okay. All right. Thanks, guys. Great seeing you all today. Hope you're all doing well. Just keep emailing and bugging people. You want to teach more classes? Just bug people. Just be annoying, and that may happen. Be polite. Don't tell them I told you to bug them. But like if you want, you tell the school what you want. The school likes giving it to the students if it's not too difficult. And different teachers get different assignments. So I'm happy to do stuff. All right. Take care, everybody, and I'll see you next week. And if you have any questions, I'm on Slack. Bye.
Peace out.
Bye.